Today's lecture, pretty much today, I'm going to talk about the background of the Reformation. I'll talk about how the rise of Protestantism starts like around the 16th century. I'll talk about the different religious sects that kind of break away from the Catholic Church, and I'll get into the Catholic Reformation. And whenever time I've got to also talk about a lot of the major parts of the Reformation, of course, that occur overall. Of course, I did have some, I think, reminders I had the other day. I know y'all had to finish up the pre-test, and I think it was the student contract policy page. I think those may have closed, but if you're still in the class, you need to make that up. Let me know. You can kind of still do that, I guess, if you haven't completed those both. But if you didn't do those by yesterday, you probably will get purged from the class, most likely. Looks like Nicholas is watching us also as well. T. Nicholas, so I hope you're having a great time out there as well overall. So that video I showed you was from National Geographic. I think it's called History 101, the Protestant Reformation. They have a lot of these short little videos that kind of go into historical events, famous things that happen in history overall. Today, of course, if you have any comments, questions during the live stream, of course, of this lecture, please let me know. Of course, you can always leave me, of course, comments later on my YouTube channel, or you can also email. I think everybody's got my email address already. If you want to subscribe to my channel, you can do as well. So, like I'm saying, today we're going to go into the Reformation. Of course, a famous topic, that really has had a major effect on world history, especially parts of Europe and I guess the Americas. I know in North America, I know it's been a major influence overall. So I'll kind of go ahead and talk about the background of the Reformation, like what it was first, I guess, overall. And I'll kind of get more into some of the famous people that were in the Reformation, like Martin Luther. I think he was one of the most famous. You may have heard also John Calvin, etc. So, yeah, one of the first things I usually ask is, what was the Reformation, which they're usually talking about primarily the Protestant Reformation. However, there was a Catholic Reformation, Catholic revival that also began too in the 16th century. And the Reformation was this religious schism that happened in the Catholic Church, where basically people that were kind of unsatisfied with the way the Catholic Church was, thought it was too corrupt, wanted to break away, form their own movements. And so that led to the development of these different religious sects, Christian sects that were Protestant, like Lutheran, Calvin, Calvinistic type, Presbyterian, Anglican Church, etc. All eventually broke away because of that. And the causes of the Reformation don't start with Martin Luther. That's something that isn't true about that. They do think that a lot of the causes of the Reformation go back before this. They go back to mostly medieval Europe. And I can throw in a lot of different examples of things that I think were major causes that they think caused the Reformation in general. You can look at a lot of different things. I know they had problems with the buying and selling of church offices going back to the Middle Ages, which they called it sometimes simony. That was a major issue, of example of corruption that was in the church. I know they fought with lay investiture as well, like the popes were trying to stop, monarchs from appointing clerical officials and things like that. Was a problem. I know when Martin Luther went to Rome, like earlier in his career as a priest, he found a lot of clergy living in luxury. So that was another problem they had. You had cases where a lot of clergy were not being celibate. They secretly had wives or mistresses. They even had affairs with nuns and things like that. There was also illiteracy. Some clergy were not very literate. Were following liturgical duties and things like that. And so those are all issues that were major problems that were in the Catholic Church. I think if you even study about the Middle Ages, they even had this period in the late Middle Ages where they had the so-called papal schism or Western schism, where they had two popes at the same time. So those are examples of some issues that were there that kind of went back to, going back to medieval times. There were even early reformers. I think they were talking about that in that little short video by National Geographic, but they had famous early reformers back in the 14th, 15th centuries, like Jan Hus, who was in Bohemia, and John Wycliffe in England. They actually tried to make some early reforms, but Hus was burned at the stake. And then Wycliffe, I think, was imprisoned in England. He died in prison, and so they weren't able to really make any reforms at that time until Martin Luther, of course, came along. And so, yeah, that's the thing, of course, that's real famous, as you know. Probably the most famous figure of the whole Reformation is Martin Luther. I think when they did a thing, I think it was a few years ago, when they had the top 5 people of the last 1,000 years. I know Martin Luther was in the top 5, definitely being the most influential last 1,000 years ago or so. And Martin Luther was a German reformer that was part of the whole Reformation. That was originally a priest. He was a monk, Augustinian monk in the Catholic Church. But Luther was also not just that. Luther was also a theology professor. He had several degrees, and he taught at the University of Wittenberg, which was in Saxony, Germany, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And anyway, what influenced Luther to eventually get involved in what became the Reformation later was because of the issue you may have heard of, which are called indulgences, which they were kind of talking about in that short video. See here, the so-called indulgence. And the indulgence was this deal where you could get your sins, forgiven for those that were in purgatory, like your family, like family members or whatever. Not really yourself, but say your uncle or your father or whoever it is that's dead, that their soul might be in purgatory. You could get their sins forgiven so that they could go to heaven. And so you would pay so much money to the church, and then so they could do that. And so this became real popular, I think, around the 16th century. Apparently, there was this preacher, this Catholic preacher that was going around, like in Germany, selling a lot of indulgences. His name was Johann Tetzel. I heard of him. And so Luther was heavily influenced by Tetzel to eventually write later be like the so-called 95 Theses. And apparently the Catholic Church at the time, part of why they were selling indulgences a lot, they were building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So they're trying to collect money for the church. And so Luther thought that what they were doing was wrong. I guess they're kind of almost like buying your way into heaven. I guess he felt about that. He also felt like the Pope was, too powerful, that really the Pope wasn't really the leader of the church, in that really the whole basis of Christianity was really the Bible, and not what some man said in Rome, like far away from Germany. And so, as you know, what eventually happened was in 1517, famously, Martin Luther, of course, posted the so-called 95 Theses, which, supposedly was posted on the date of October 31st, 1517. And, of course, they show a lot of images of that. Like you'll see this image where he's posting the 95 Theses. Some people think that's apocrypha, that he himself didn't do it, like go up there and, nail it to the door or whatever. Probably sent somebody to probably do it. But the 95 Theses was not just critical toward the issue of, indulgences. It went to the heart of the matter. It went actually to the act of the Catholic Church and the Pope in general, and basically said they were corrupt. And here's actually the image of where it was posted. It was posted to the front door of the main church in Wittenberg, Germany, which was in Saxony. and originally called the so-called Wittenberg Church Castle, which was originally a Catholic church. Now, of course, it's known as All Saints Church, which is now a Lutheran church, as you know. And today it actually has the actual 95 Theses written in the actual door itself. And so today they call it the Thesis Door. I think is the common nickname they dub. I think they just call it the Castle Church. I think is kind of the nickname I think a lot of Germans call it today. But the 95 Theses is really what, like I said, started the whole Reformation at that point. Luther even sent a copy, I think, to the Bishop of Mainz as well, I think. But eventually the actual 95 Theses reached all the way up to the Pope, Pope Leo X. Of course, even read it at one point. And this ended up, of course, creating a lot of problems, not only for Luther and, of course, the Reformation, but Leo X was the main Catholic leader of the Catholic Church from about 1513 to 1521. He'll eventually condemn Luther. He'll actually send him a papal bull in 1520, which a papal bull is a kind of like a letter or decree that comes directly from the Pope on the Catholic Church. This one was issued, I think, in June of 1520. They often call it Exsurge Domine, which means arise, O Lord. And basically, they told Luther that he had 60 days to recant what he had said in the 95 Theses. I think they even, out of the 95, list of things he says written in there, I think they censored about 41 of them at one point. And Luther, instead of recanting, as you know, he took the actual papal bull and he burned it. And you can see that little bonfire right there where he burned it in Wittenberg. And there's actually a tree there now at the site of where Luther supposedly burned the papal bull that was sent by the Pope, December 10th, 1520. And some people think that's where really the whole Reformation begins, right there, when he burns it. That tree was not there when he burned it. I think that tree was put there, I want to say, a few decades ago. It's the spot where they think he burned it, I guess. But it's called the Lutherreich, which means, I think, Luther Oak. But basically, with him, with that act right there, what ends up happening is you get eventually the beginning of a new religion that'll eventually emerge out of that, which will be, of course, they later just call it Lutheranism, which is something I think called it initially, as you know, a Church of Luther, basically. And of course, they were proud of the name, and so they kept it and all that. And so that becomes the first Protestant faith that kind of breaks away from the Catholic Church. And of course, today, over 60 million people practice it worldwide, just to kind of give you an idea. So Luther itself, I guess he started this revolution in general that kind of broke away from the church. And there's also a lot of people in Germany that are not really in favor of the Catholic Church either. They call a lot of the people that are pro-Catholic Romanists. Even a lot of the princes or rulers of Germany start to even back Martin Luther and things like that. And so that's part of what causes a lot of the division in Europe afterwards, because of the different religions that kind of break away from that. You can see from this that these are some of the things that Luther changes with this new religion that'll kind of be influenced by him. Protestantism. Yeah, he's going to change the Catholic Mass, where they come up with like their own Protestant catechism and things like that. They even take the Bible, they begin translating it. In fact, Luther even began to translate like the New Testament into German, as you know. Even a lot of songs and things like that are all, in German instead of, say, Latin, etc. Let me also talk about, what are some of the differences between, what's the theological differences between Lutheranism and Catholicism, which are right there. You can see here the Lutherans they think only faith in Jesus saves your soul. Justification by faith alone. I think if you read about a lot of the Protestants, they start talking about the solas. You've heard about the solas, which I kind of have a list of them that are kind of right here. I think they call them the 5 solas that they have. Sola scriptura, by scripture alone. Sola fide, by faith alone, which is one that I guess is the most famous one. Sola gratia, by grace alone. Later they added some other ones, solus Christus, or variations of that, Christ alone, or with Christ alone, or sole Deo gloria, glory to God alone. So so-called 5 solas, they sometimes dub them overall. Lutheranism, religious truth is the Bible. So the Bible is the most important aspect, of course, in a Christian's faith. Not what the Pope says, in Rome and things like that. They got rid of most of the Catholic sacraments. The only 2 they kept was baptism and communion, which I think in a lot of Christian Protestant religions, they don't call it baptism a lot. A lot of times they might call it a christening, something like that. And then communion, they usually, I think later or Eucharist, they use the term like Lord's Supper, things like that as well. The local prince rules over the church, not the, say, Pope or whatever. Priests can marry. That's something you see too. The communion of the body and blood of Christ and the bread of wine. That was another issue that was different with the Catholics versus the Lutherans. The Lutherans didn't think that actually happened, at least not a miracle like that occurred where it kind of changed or whatever. We can see the Catholics, they pretty much believe not just in faith alone, but sacraments and doing good deeds and things like that. They still believe in the Bible and the church teachings and things like that. They kept the sacraments, like all of them. They didn't get rid of them. They kept the Virgin Mary and the saints and all that stuff. The Pope is still the head of the church in Rome. Priests still can't marry. They have to be celibate and things like that. In the Catholic faith, they have, they really believe that the blood and the body and blood of Christ actually converted, like the actual, the wine, the bread, and all that. So those are things that are really something that are, of course, different from both the Lutheran versus the Catholics. Oh, and here's those things I was talking about, the whole, consubstantiation versus transubstantiation, which is something that's, a big difference between, I guess, the Lutherans and the Pope. Like the Catholic Church believes in transubstantiation, where they think that the bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ. They think it was a miracle that happened and all that. And then Luther, they think it's more of a spiritual change that's really present, but the bread and wine are not transformed. So those are things that are kind of a little different, compared to the 2 religions. Luther, though, was given a second chance, which is, true about that. Martin Luther was summoned in April of 1521 to the Diet of Worms. So the Diet of Worms was like the main assembly of the Holy Roman Empire, which was led by Emperor Charles V. So he meets with him basically on that date, April 18th, with the emperor. And he was basically asked to recant again. And of course, Luther refused again to do it. And so what happened was the emperor, Charles V, then declared him an outlaw. I think they had an edict he issued called the Edict of Worms, where Luther was declared a heretic. A lot of his writings were banned and things like that, where he couldn't practice his ideas and stuff like that. But in the end, it didn't really help to squash the spread of Protestantism. Later, I'll talk about it. But Charles V will eventually have to sue for peace with the Protestants, Lutherans, with the Peace of Augsburg because of that. So that was the so-called Diet of Worms. You want to look right here, which I think the Worms is in the western part, the kind of the Rhine area, western part of Germany is where it was. It practically put him on trial for almost heresy. Here's a famous castle I did want to mention about, which is well known. It's called Wartburg Castle. Apparently, Luther was given refuge by the ruler of Saxony. His name was Frederick III, who they call Frederick the Wise. He was elector of Saxony. He gave him refuge, and eventually Luther lived there for a while, where he was able to, begin translating things like the New Testament into Germany and all that. And so he helps to kind of spread, the whole Protestant movement. Which, if you remember correctly, the other thing that helped to spread it was Johann Gutenberg. Of course, the printing press was, a big thing that really helped to spread it. As you know, a lot of the ideas of the Reformation, because of Gutenberg's invention back in the 15th century, and so that's what really began the whole Reformation, in the early 16th century. Luther was also very famous for being one of the first Protestants to marry. He actually broke from the church and started to marry. He married this woman named Katharina von Bora, who was an ex-nun. They married in 1525. They had several children, by the way. Anyway, suppose there was a story behind this. I don't even heard about it before, but apparently a few years before, I want to say 1522, I forget when it was, right before, a few years before, I know, Luther helped about 12 nuns escape from a convent because they were trying to close the convents down and monasteries. And so apparently he found wives for all of them except one nun, Katharina von Bora. And she suggested that they ought to get married. I think she asked him, that kind of deal. And so he ended up marrying her. They had several kids. They had, of course, afterwards. So a lot of these Protestant reformers would, end up, getting married. They were like priests or whatever, that kind of deal, or former priests overall. So that was Martin Luther, who he is, a very famous figure, of course, who helped start, of course, the Reformation. Now, they also got another figure I did want to talk about as well, which is John Calvin. He's a very famous figure. The other one that's probably big, too, is Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1564. He helped spread it as well. Calvin, kind of blowing him up here, was actually, it looks like an English name. He's actually French. He was a French lawyer and Protestant reformer that broke from Catholicism. He was influenced by Luther. And so he spread his own brand of Protestantism, which later became known as Calvinism. That's the kind of the nickname they called it, which Calvinism was actually a bunch of different Protestant type religions and churches that were spawned afterwards. They were called Congregational, I think, Christianity, Reformed Christianity, or Reformed churches was the common name they often used. And those, in Scotland, they had the so-called Presbyterian church you probably heard of as well. And they were the idea of this Calvinist movement was heavily influenced by a book that he wrote, which was published in 1536, called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. This particular book was written 1536, I think originally published in Latin and then later French and other languages. And it was a summary of Protestant beliefs, I guess what the Protestant prayers or masses would be, or catechism that they would use. So it's like a textbook of how the Protestant religion works, how their church is run and all that. And you can see they viewed men and women as sinful by nature because they believed that God had already determined, who was, destined to go to heaven and who was not. Because a lot of the Protestants, rejected the idea that there was a purgatory, either going to heaven or you're going to hell. And of course, one of the big things that was big in Calvinism is predestination, or what they call predeterminism, which is the idea that God has already predetermined pretty much from the beginning of time, where everybody's souls are destined, like heaven or hell. They say that God knows everything, that God, knows when you're going to be born, when you're going to die, who you're going to marry, and things like that overall. So that was something that's a big part of the religion. Even I think some of the Calvinistic, sects believe that there's like a elect group of people where they've been already selected by God to be saved, and so these are beliefs that they have overall. They also believed in religious theocracy, like a lot of the, about that. They believe this idea of church governance to run things, like church elders that run these churches overall. They also believe in the idea of absolute sovereignty. So these are ideas that are practiced in Calvinism. See it a lot later, like in England, Scotland. You see it in America, like say in Massachusetts with the Puritans and things like that later on. Calvin, by the way, was influenced by, I'm trying to think if I got him here somewhere. There he is right there. He influenced John Knox. I kind of mentioned him a little bit, but Knox, about Calvin. Calvin later fled France and he went to Switzerland, and John Knox met him, who was from Scotland. And so Knox later decided to start his own Reformation in Scotland, which became known as the Scottish Reformation. And so what happened was that eventually led to the so-called Church of Scotland forming, which in Scotland they later called the Kirk, which Kirk just means church. And so this became known as Presbyterianism. So they usually dub it later. And it was called Presbyterianism because the church was run by these church elders instead of like priests or whatever. They were called a presbyter, and so hence the name being used. And so Presbyterianism from there spread all over the world. There's branches of it, America and other places throughout the world. But Knox was considered like one of the founders of it and all that. So they go through the Scottish Reformation. And the Scots try to, stamp out Catholicism, throughout the country and all that. So yeah, I was kind of talking about him. And by the way, Calvin later, like I said, fled to Switzerland, eventually to Geneva, where he kind of set up his own brand of religious theocracy that was there. And it was like basically a city run by religious leaders. That's pretty much what it was. They had very strict laws. Some people call them later blue laws, if you want. But basically, everybody had to attend like religious classes, couldn't wear certain kinds of clothes, couldn't do certain things like you could play games or gambling. I think on certain days like Sunday, you can't do certain things, sports, and other things like that. Overall, everything just closes down, et cetera. Everybody has to go to church. If you don't follow all the rules, you could be punished, sent to jail, excommunicated, banished. There's even cases where people were actually executed for not following the strict laws. Later, it's like that on the Puritans, like in England, I think in Massachusetts, the so-called Bible Commonwealth in colonial America. And so, yeah, the Calvinists, the Puritans like that were real religiously strict. Also, another figure that was big in the Reformation was Ulrich Zwingli, who, by the way, was a Swiss reformer who died young, by the way, lived in 1484 to 1531. I think his movement was sometimes called Zwingliism, compared to, say, Lutheranism and Calvinism. And he was a major reformer that also came right after Luther as well. He broke from the Catholic Church and began preaching his own brand of Protestantism in Zurich, Switzerland, basically. His was like pretty puritanical as well, like Calvin. And he wanted to close down all the monasteries, close down all the convents. He also believed in the idea of clerical marriage, that the clergy can marry and he also, I think, married too after that as well. Only thing was, he and Luther did not get along. There was a case where apparently Zwingli met actual Martin Luther. I think it was called the Marburg Colloquy, which happened in October of 1529. The two met to discuss the differences between their ideas, Lutheranism versus Zwingliism. And I don't know if you know about what they disagreed on. They couldn't agree on the whole communion Eucharist thing, like the Lord's Supper and all that. And Luther still believes in that, the whole idea of what he called, I think we talked about the idea of the differences where he believes in the consubstantiation, right? We talked about where he thought there was a spiritual change there. Now, it wasn't transformed, the bread and the wine and all that. But I think what was different about Zwingli was Zwingli thought it was just more symbolic, is what it was. And so they didn't agree on that, the whole Eucharist, Lord's Supper thing, which was kind of a big difference. That's part of why they say Protestants will split more because of things like that. Also, they have as well another brand of the Reformation I did want to talk about that's real famous is the radical reformers, so-called radical Reformation, which involved especially a group called the Anabaptists that were well known. These were people that didn't really fit into the Catholic or the Protestants that were kind of forming, like Calvin or Lutheran or whatever, that didn't like that, and they kind of broke even more radical to the left, I guess. And like they wanted to abolish private property. They had new ideas on baptism where they believed in what they call a believer's baptism, where they thought that people should get baptized until they're like an adult. They rejected the idea of infant baptism. In fact, the word Anabaptist means rebaptizer or to be baptized again. What it means. They wanted separation of church and state. So these are ideas that they kind of pushed. And predominantly these groups were around Germany, maybe in Switzerland, and included like groups like the Amish, the Mennonites, the Baptists and Quakers kind of break away with that groups right there. Amish Mennonites, I think, were the original ones that were kind of famous. And I think the Hutterites was another group that was also in there you may have heard of as well. But I think some are now called Anabaptists still today. No, Amish and Mennonite are the most famous that we know today in the United States, but those are all considered radical reformers that didn't really fit in. You can see about where they were. They were mostly around the Holy Roman Empire, and I think in Switzerland where they were too as well. A lot of them would actually flee and come to like America and other places because they were heavily persecuted and weren't really given equal rights compared to other religious sects. Then another aspect of the Reformation that's real well known is the English Reformation, which was started in Tudor England in the 16th century is when it mostly occurs. It happens mostly under Henry VIII, and it goes up to like the time of like Queen Elizabeth I. And you can see it happened mostly under the King Henry VIII. He was the monarch of England from 1509 to 1547, part of the so-called Tudor dynasty. And as you know, Henry's famous for mostly two things. He's famous for the English Reformation. He's also well known for his so-called six wives, the six wives of Henry VIII, which you see there. And apparently the whole issue with his first wife, you see, which is at the top left here, which is Catherine of Aragon, who was from Spain. He apparently did not have any surviving male heirs. He only had like one daughter. And so what caused the whole English Reformation to occur was the fact that he wanted to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, who would be his second wife later, because he wanted a male heir, basically to continue his dynasty and all that. And so that caused him to break with the Catholic Church, who later excommunicated him for doing that. And so Henry VIII would form this new church, which it's got different names. They call, of course, Church of England is the common name they called it, but it's also called the Anglican Church as well, or Anglicanism. It did start out as like a quasi-Catholic church with Henry VIII as the ruler of it, the head of it at one point, because he kind of takes over all the church lands and even has church bishops under him, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, etc. And he forced all the Catholic clergy that were there to basically conform to his church or imprison or kill them. And I think there was some like Sir Thomas More who refused to do it. And so he was executed, I think, for it, etc. He took over pretty much closed all the convents, closed all the monasteries, took all control of the church lands, etc. Which all that is kind of, he wanted that for money and power as well. But over time, Anglicanism will change. It will become more Protestant. It was heavily influenced by Calvinism. And by the time of King Edward, I believe the sixth, I believe it is, you've got basically a more Protestant church. That'll be later. So I'll talk more about that later today. I'm not really going to go into the English Reformation, but when I get to talking about the history of England, we'll get more into it. Now, also, I want to talk about the other thing that happened too in the Reformation that's well known. They have what they call the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, as it's sometimes called as well. This was like a revival that occurred in the Catholic Church to counter the Protestant churches that were kind of forming against it. So it's called all kinds of names. I think Catholic revival is the common name they called it. The Protestants call it counter-reformation sometimes too. So trying to counter them, etc. But they do know that the Catholic Reformation was started by the Pope Paul III. You see in that picture right there at the top in kind of red. And he's founded this ecumenical council that's called the Council of Trent, 1545, which met in northern Italy, city of Trent or Trento, which met, by the way, over a series of years, up to 1563. And the whole point of this ecumenical council was to reaffirm, traditions of the Catholic Church, to prevent people from trying to leave the church, things like that. And there were a lot of different consequences that came out of the whole, Council of Trent afterwards, of course. I'll kind of talk about, because they're going to reaffirm a lot of these traditions that are part of the church. They reject the idea of a lot of the ideas that the Protestants, want to do at that point. I think it was at first they were going to try to maybe talk to them, but then they decided that wasn't the best thing to do at all. I've got a list of, I know it's a lot of things there, but those are examples of a lot of things that pretty much they decided to keep with the Catholic Church. They kept all the sacraments. I told you, remember, a lot of the Protestants were rejecting most of those, except for communion. You remember, I think was one of them. I think they had kept in forms of baptism, but everything else had been rejected, so they kept everything with that. The saints, so veneration of saints, veneration of the Virgin Mary, that was all kept, of course. Catholic Church. Vulgate Bible. They said that the traditional Bible that would be used by the Catholic Church would be the Latin Bible. This idea of, converting it into different languages was something they tried to forbid at first. Latin Mass. So all the Masses would be in Latin. It's pretty much like that up to the 20th century. That all Catholic Masses are in Latin. The Roman Catechism, they created that, which are doctrines and teachings of the church to teach priests, lay people about the doctrines of the church and what they are, etc., prayers and all that. As the Protestants were doing the same thing as well. They opened up seminaries or schools to educate clergy, etc. They did ban indulgences, which was done in 1567, years later, but they did ban them, I guess too late, but they did. They also started to enact something called the Roman Inquisition, This was like these heresy trials where they put people on trial who were against the church. That's something that a lot of people get caught up in, of course, later. There's even a case where they had this thing called the list of prohibited books that the council kind of came up with, which banned various heretical works that you couldn't read if you were a Catholic. And so this ban actually was on the Catholic Church up to the 1960s, believe it or not. And I think it has a Latin name, they call it, which is Index Librorum Prohibitorum, and it included all kinds of people. You think of kind of people that are kind of banned in the church, but Galileo, Denis Diderot, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Nicholas Copernicus, Francis Bacon, Immanuel Kant, Rene Descartes, John Locke. Those are all people that were at one point banned by the Catholic Church. Surprisingly, they didn't ban Charles Darwin. That's one you probably think of they would ban or something like that, but they didn't, believe it or not. Then you've got also this other thing that formed too that was part of the Catholic Reformation too. That was the Jesuits, the so-called Society of Jesus was founded in the 1540s, which was a Catholic order of priests that became well known. And they were big in the Reformation. They were directly under the Pope. And Jesuits is like short for that, Society of Jesus, just their symbol right there, their logo. And it had several founders. The most famous founder you probably heard of is Ignatius of Loyola, who was an ex-Spanish priest who apparently got injured or something like that, or wounded, and decided to become a priest. And he helped form the organization in the 1540s. He formed it actually with these two other priests you may have heard of named Peter Faber and also St. Francis Xavier. It's also named after a bunch of schools. Like Loyola and Xavier have a lot of schools and universities named after him today overall. And so he became eventually, Loyola became the first, what they call superior general, is what they call the leader of the Jesuits overall. And he had this book he wrote, which came out in the 16th century, called the Spiritual Exercises. That might be the wrong date on it, but that actual book is very important, instrumental in influencing the Jesuits later. Actually, that should be 1522. Got the wrong date for some reason there. So that's kind of like Loyola, who he was famous for in his movement. They also got, I don't know if you ever heard of another group I did want to mention that's also famous that came out of the whole, Catholic Counter-Reformation. They also had the Ursulines. You ever heard of them? The Order of St. Ursula was very famous. And basically, both these orders are well known for creating like seminaries, schools, convents, monasteries, things like that. They create, but Ursulines were more for like convents, for nuns, and also educating girls, like Catholic girls with schools right there. I think that building you're looking at is the Ursuline Academy, which is in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's one of the oldest Catholic schools, I think, in the South that they have. I think founded in 1727 is when it is. But that's what they're kind of known for. But they kind of formed out of the whole Catholic Counter-Reformation as well. I did want to mention about witch hunts or the witch craze that kind of happened also in the Reformation. That's something that was really a big part that kind of peaked in the Reformation, especially up to the 30 Years' War, which is, I guess, when the Reformation eventually ends. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, there was a case where people were obsessed with trying to hunt for witches or a witch purge throughout different countries, not just Europe, but North America. They have heard of the Salem witch trials that happened in America, in colonial America. You can see here a lot of countries like Germany, I think, was the main area where most people were killed the most, especially, I think, around the 30 Years' War overall. But a lot of this goes back to like the Black Death. And so a lot of women were accused of being witches, and some men as well. But you could see Germany, Switzerland, France, believe it or not, Scotland, there's a lot of people that were killed at one point for being witches. And there was even a handbook that came out back in the 15th century called Malus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, which was written by this witch hunter named Heinrich Kramer, I think in Germany. And it shows you how you could hunt for witches and root them out and all that. And so that kind of made people kind of obsess about hunting people for being witches. And so a lot of people were tortured into basically confessing to become witches. Like women, they would rip your breasts, things like that. They would put you on the wheel or a rack to torture you. So all kinds of different thumb screws. I know one popular one was to basically torture you by crushing your fingers or crushing your toes and dunking you in water, and different methods like that were some very painful, etc. So witch hunts kind of go up, like I said, even up to like the 1700s. I think there's some obsession over it, believe it or not. All right, I did want to go ahead and move on to today. I'm going to talk about also some other things that happened too in the Reformation that we need to get to. Now, going back to Germany, they had this thing called the Peace of Augsburg that came out. It's often called different names. They call it the Peace of Augsburg or the Augsburg Settlement, which you can see they were signed on, they think, September 25th, 1555, in the city of Augsburg, which is in Germany today. And what it was this agreement, religious peace treaty that was signed between the Catholics and the Lutherans, which the people involved, by the way, if you want to know, from the screen, it involved the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which was Germany at the time, named Charles V. And he signed this agreement with an alliance of Lutheran princes that were called the Schmalkaldic League, which was named after a city that was called Schmalkalden, which is, I think, in southern Germany. What it did was it divided basically Germany into two separate religions. You have, after that, you get those that are the Catholic communion versus the Lutheran communion. And so the ruler, whoever the ruler was of that state, would decide what the people's religion would be. And so there was an actual saying that they started using afterwards to describe, what the religion would be. And it's in Latin, which was cuius regio, eius religio. So whose realm, his religion. So if the ruler's Catholic, guess what? Basically, the communion's going to be Catholic. If they're Lutheran, basically everybody's going to be Lutheran. Now, it excluded other people, like the people that couldn't get it, like this religious freedom or whatever. The Calvinists, the Anabaptists, they were not included in it, which was later a problem that they think helps to cause like the 30 Years' War. But they did allow a grace period where you could move to like a religious, like a domain where your communion is and all that. And so if you look at this map here to show you kind of, I guess, Europe at the time, especially in Germany, you can see how they started to divide. Those like in the northern part of Germany become more Lutheran. And then you can see like southern, like Bohemia, going down in Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, and all that, France, all that's Catholic. That's there. So you can see you've got, Germany here, you got Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Prussia, all those areas pretty much eventually start to go more, of course, Lutheran. So that pretty much Europe stays that way for quite a while, at least up to the 20th century. Northern Europe is more Protestant and Southern Europe is more Catholic, but not really anymore, but it used to be. So that's something that kind of is very famous that happens because of the Peace of Augsburg and all that, but it didn't really solve the problems like it should have. and I'll get to it later, it's going to cause the 30 Years' War to break out. Then I'm going to talk also about another event that happened too in France. In France, they have something else happen that's called the French Wars of Religion, where what happens is kind of like a civil war where you have French Catholics, French Roman Catholics, end up fighting against French Calvinists, those that support Calvin's doctrines, and they're called Huguenots, by the way, in France. And the peak of this will later lead to an event that's called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. I'll kind of get into that later, which doesn't really happen until 1572, about 10 years later. But they do think it was influenced by this woman I did want to mention about, which is Catherine de' Medici. She was a very powerful figure. You may have heard of the Medicis. They were like a type of dynasty that was in Italy. They were involved in a lot of different royal families had married into, and she was at one point the Queen of France. And a lot of the peak of violence in the actual French Wars of Religion occur under her. In fact, at one point, 3 of her sons were kings of France. France II, Charles IX, Henry III, who, by the way, are the last of the so-called Valois dynasty, which was a famous French royal dynasty in the Middle Ages. They all didn't have any kids, and it died out. If you know about that. Anyway, they think she helped to instigate what later became known as the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, which they think happened in August of 1572. What was that? They believe it was a Catholic mob violence and also a bunch of assassinations that were directed at Huguenots, those that were French Calvinists or Protestants in the country. And they think it was also sparked by this incident that happened too, as well. I did want to mention about, which is famous. Apparently, the daughter of Catherine de' Medici, her name was Margaret of Valois, she married Henry of Navarre, who was actually a Huguenot. I guess they're trying to marry the two together. And it actually caused differences where basically Catholics were angered about that. He's important later, Henry of Navarre, because he'll go on to become King Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of the Bourbon dynasty in France. But apparently that marriage, I think it was his first of 2 wives he had, that actual marriage would, they think, help spark it, believe it or not. But it created like mob violence where, Catholics are hunted down, like in paintings or images like this one you're looking at. They're not sure the amount of Huguenots that were killed, but I think they claim that it was anywhere from like 10 to 30,000 people that were killed. I think some people think it was exaggerated by the Protestants later. I think some claim, I think at one point, I think there used to be a claim where it was like 100,000 people killed or whatever. I don't think it's that many people that were actually killed, but they do think that the French Wars of Religion total may have killed up to wounded up to people, maybe like 3 million casualties. So it was pretty bloody conflict overall. It did influence this painter, by the way, named Francois Dubois, to make this painting you're looking at, which is later called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, same name as the event. And it does depict a lot of the massacres that they think happened in Paris, like in August of 1572. It also included the death of this, I don't know if you see in that image there, but there's a man kind of sticking out the window. Looks like he's dead. If you see like up here, but apparently one of the leaders of the Huguenots, he was an admiral. He was named Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. He was actually killed in the actual Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And so it was depicted by Francois Dubois in that painting. What ended the whole French Wars of Religion was the Edict of Nantes, which was issued by King Henry IV when he came in as the founder of the Bourbon dynasty. He became the first Bourbon king in 1589. And this particular edict, what it did basically was it gave, you can see there, Huguenots religious freedom to practice their religion without persecution in the country. It restored peace and basically ended the whole French wars of religion. Even like Huguenots or French Calvinists could, hold political offices, run towns like mayors of towns and things like that throughout France. And so the idea that France was one king, one law, one religion was something that they kind of got rid of at that point. But Catholicism was still the main, official religion of the country. In fact, I think it was a case where Huguenots even had to pay tithes to the Catholic Church and things like that, obey holidays or whatever, but they couldn't be persecuted for their religion. They could have their own churches, and they could even have, Protestant schools and things like that. So, in a sense, that whole, they say that, basically later it's going to lead to more secularism throughout France, separation of church and state, which will take a while. That'll happen more when the French Revolution, age of Napoleon comes in. By the way, today in France, 41% of the population is Catholic. You wonder what happened, where did all the Protestants go and all that? Well, I'll get to it later under Louis XIV, but he eventually will revoke the Edict of Nantes, so-called Edict of Fontainebleau, 1685. And I think today in France, I was looking at it a while back, but there's only 2% of the French population is Protestant today. That's amazing. But later, Louis XIV kicked them out. But you can see 41% of the country is Catholic today. 40% have no religion. 19%, the rest are other religions. Believe it or not, the largest religion beyond Catholic is Muslim. I bet you probably knew that, I guess. So anyway, that was the so-called Edict of Nantes, which, kept really France from devolving into, total civil war. Now, I'm going to move on lastly today to talk about one more thing, which is the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War, if you study about it, was the peak of conflicts in the Reformation, like in the religious conflicts that were occurring in Europe, which you can see it happened over a period of 30 years, hence the name that they called it. And it happened mostly in Germany. But it did spread to other areas. Like it was mostly within the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, but it devolved into involving other countries over time. Countries like France got involved, England got involved, Scandinavian countries got involved, Spain got involved. At first, it was a religious conflict, and then it devolved into a political differences between different countries throughout Europe. Overall. And I'll kind of get into kind of one of the things that helped to kind of cause it. Mostly it was caused by religious tensions due to a new emperor that came in, that took over the Holy Roman Empire, which was Emperor Ferdinand II, who was part of the Habsburg dynasty or House of Habsburg, which is an old dynasty that went back to the 13th century in medieval Europe. And he had been originally the king of Bohemia before this. And anyway, Ferdinand was a big proponent of the Counter Reformation, trying to reconvert Protestants back to being Catholic. And so he wanted to reconvert certain areas of Germany to being, basically Catholic. And so you end up with a big civil war because of that. You got there is Emperor Ferdinand II. You can see right there in that picture. And what's going to happen is you're going to end up seeing a deal where a bunch of Protestant sides will form on one side. Like on one side, you've got these Protestants that want to back their brothers in Germany that are kind of like Lutheran or whatever. Sweden, Denmark, Saxony, Prussia, They all kind of support them. France, I'll get to later, actually sides with them, believe it or not, but it's not really over religious reasons. It's more political, dynastic, more than anything, probably even economic as well. Then the Catholics involve a lot of different. Holy Roman Empire is involved, Austria, Spain, uh, everywhere where the Habsburgs are, I guess, have power in Europe, etc. And the whole war itself needed a spark. And there was an incident that happened in 1618, you may have heard of, called the Defenestration of Prague, where some representatives were thrown out of a window. Like these three Catholic representatives that came to Prague in Bohemia, they were thrown out of a third-story window of a building. By the grace of God, apparently, they survived. I think the story was that they fell on a dung heap, is what the Protestants said. And I think the Catholics said it was a miracle that angels saved them. That's what it was. But apparently this whole thing sparked both sides to form their own separate armies and all that to fight against each other. And so on one side, you had the so-called Catholic League that formed, that brought up armies, like the armies of the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Bavaria, and then the Spanish, also your Habsburg, sent mercenaries to fight with the Catholic League as well. And the Protestant side had their side, Protestant Union, it was called, which was comprised of like different states in northern Germany and all that. Or those were Lutheran, and I think that they were backed by a lot of Scandinavian states like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were also kind of in on it. It was later called the Heilbronn League as well. And one of the weird things about the 30 Years' War, you look at this slide here, it goes through various phases, like 4 or 5 at one point. They had the so-called Bohemian phase or revolt. They got the Danish phase, the Swedish phase, and then, of course, the Swedish-French. The French come in also as well. And first phase, that was really the first thing that was real famous about 30 Years' War was the Bohemian Revolt and all that, where the Czechs, formed their own armies at that point to fight against the Holy Roman Empire. And there was a famous battle associated with that was called the Battle of White Mountain, which happened in November of 1620, which you can see here. And what happened was the Protestant side was severely beaten, like badly. I think they were outnumbered in the battle. I think the Holy Roman Empire's armies had 27,000 troops, and the Bohemians only had 15,000, and they got routed in the battle. That was a very pivotal battle. The Battle of White Mountain is instrumental because what it does, if you know about it, the Catholics are able to come in and reconvert Bohemia, which I think for the next 300 years or so, that area is mostly Catholic, which it will. So, yeah, that phase, but that failed, that aspect of the whole 30 Years' War. Then they had a bunch of foreign powers that came in support of the war. On the left there in that picture, kind of with that red background, the King of Denmark, Norway supported the war, sending in Protestant forces into Germany in the 1620s. He was known as Christian IV, who was king of Denmark, Norway for years. He ruled for 59 years in power. He was really not that successful in the war compared to Sweden, which I'll get to a little bit. But Christian IV is known for founding the capital of Norway today, which is Oslo. They also have another figure you may have heard of named King Gustavus Adolphus. He's really the most famous foreign power ruler that was involved in the 30 Years' War. The Swedes often called him all kinds of names, like the Lion of the North, the Great, and died real young. He only died, I think he died at the age of 37, but he was this militaristic king that was very successful in the war. And really up to the 1630s, the most successful battle that the Protestant side really had was the Battle of Lutzen, which happened in November of 1632, where Adolphus' forces defeated the armies of the Holy Roman Empire in a decisive victory. But the only thing was, about this, he was killed in the battle. That's the only thing. So he died, like I said, real young, 37, I think it was. So Lutzen was a narrow victory for the Protestant side. They actually would end up winning, that part of the conflict, but they think it would kind of help to, I guess the Swedes were kind of disillusioned afterwards because of the fact that their king had been killed in all that. So in the end, the thing that happens with the 30 Years' War, which kind of helps to turn it around, is the French come in. The French, under the Bourbon dynasty, House of Bourbon, that ruled that country, they're kind of getting antsy about the Habsburgs, about how they have too much power in Europe, and they think that France is kind of getting surrounded by Habsburg territories, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands. And so under the chief minister of King Louis XIII, who was Cardinal Richelieu, they decided to basically back anti-Habsburg forces like Sweden, etc., in the war. And so they think that's kind of a major reason of why the Protestant side wins eventually the 30 Years' War. So that's part of what happens to really cause that. But the war itself drags on forever. It takes them years to actually end the war in the end. Let me talk about what happened at the end of the war. Well, they have a series of treaties that come out that help to end the war, 1648. They usually call it the Peace of Westphalia, or people call it Treaty of Westphalia or Westphalia. It's called that because of the fact that there were a series of treaties that were signed in the western part of Germany, an area called Westphalia or Westphalia. And there were two treaties you see that were signed there, one called Osnabrück, which you can see right here, and then another one that was called Munster. And so because of the fact that there's more than one treaty, and because of the location of it, they basically end up calling it that name. And kind of talk about the end of the war and what the results of it was overall. It did a bunch of things after the war, which are kind of famous. One of the big things is you get this whole thing where it kind of redraws the boundaries of Europe at the time. And you get a bunch of these new countries that kind of emerge, like the Dutch Republic, which some people call the Netherlands or Holland. They would become independent afterwards. Switzerland would kind of start breaking away, becoming a separate country. Prussia will later be like we call it Germany later, will eventually start breaking away and becoming more independent. All that. In fact, the Dutch in the war with Spain, that was known as the 80 Years' War, which had been going on from like 1568 to 1648. I think they call it the Dutch War of Independence. And so you get those areas that kind of become independent. It's part of why Belgium, Luxembourg, and other areas like that you hear about in Europe kind of become separate later. You'll see overall. Also, Calvinism is recognized afterwards. So, I think with the 30 Years' War, before that, going back to the Peace of Augsburg, it was only the Catholics and Lutherans that had any religious rights. But the Calvinists now had rights. But you can see the Anabaptists didn't have any, though. They're kind of excluded from it. Also, historians today believe that the Peace of Westphalia created the modern European state system, which was influenced by the Congress of Vienna, Treaty of Versailles, and all that. So that's something that you start to see too afterwards. Oh, and then the other thing you see there too, which is famous as well, France will become the big power in Europe afterwards. So they become the major powers afterwards. Holy Roman Empire is weakened after the 30 Years' War. In fact, it takes a long time for Germany to kind of make a comeback because of the fact that it was so devastated by the war, because the 30 Years' War was very bloody conflict overall. The Austrian Empire will kind of emerge later out of that area around Austria and Hungary. So you'll start to see that instead. Another thing, too, about the war as well, there were a lot of atrocities that were committed in the 30 Years' War. That's well known. They think it wiped out at one point a third of the population of Germany. That's how bad it was, this particular war. They think that the 30 Years' War may have resulted in 8 million people killed. That includes soldiers and civilians, which, by the way, in modern Europe, that is the third bloodiest conflict behind World War II and World War I, which are first and second bloodiest conflicts that were ever fought, just to kind of give you an idea of the differences between those, how bad it was. So that's part of why Germany doesn't unify until really the late 19th century, because of what happened with that conflict. The war is also known for a lot of atrocities as well. There's a series of printmakings that were done by this French printmaker named Jacques Collot, you may have heard about, which is very famous. And he had these series of etchings that were known as the Great Miseries of the War. You see right there, which I think there were like 18 of them at one point that he made, which depicted a lot of destruction that was unleashed against people throughout Germany, because a lot of people were killed, hunted down as witches and things like that. And the one you're looking at, which is the most famous one that's well known, of course, is called The Hanging, where it shows a bunch of people being hanged, which, by the way, it's interesting about it actually depicts a bunch of Catholic mercenaries being hanged by Catholics. I know it's kind of weird, but apparently they had committed a bunch of atrocities where they had killed civilians and they were executed for it. And so that's what you're actually looking at right there. But yeah, obviously, yeah, it was a very bloody conflict, the 30 Years' War. But in the end, it kind of helped to kind of, stop, I guess, the Reformation. I guess the bulk of the Reformation, the conflicts of it, kind of end afterwards. And later, things are going to get more political. They're going to be more about economic reasons between countries, and people aren't as serious about, religion, all that. So that's kind of the history of the background of the Reformation and some of the major things that happened. It wasn't everything, but that's like the major conflicts, of course, that occurred. Now, next week, I'm going to move on. We're going to, of course, talk about, I'm going to get into world exploration. We'll kind of talk about the age of discovery, about how in modern Europe, they're going to start to, explore the world, colonize different parts of the world that they don't really know much about at that time. We'll kind of talk about what they call the age of discovery. So I'll kind of get into that later, of course, next week. But I am going to, of course, be having a quiz coming up, of course, about the Reformation. Of course, I'll send out an announcement about that and post that today overall, but that'll be due later by the end of the month. I'll kind of send out like emails, announcements, of course, today. But that's pretty much it today. Doesn't look like I have any questions or comments, of course, about this lecture. But if you have any comments, questions later, after you're kind of reviewing this, go back and review this lecture more than once if you can. If you got a comment, question, please let me know anytime, day or night. You can, of course, leave me comments with this video, of course, on my YouTube channel. I'll probably have some discussions coming up, too. I'll kind of maybe go over the study guide questions, probably in Canvas. I'll probably start some kind of discussion on that sometime, probably early next week. I guess I'll do that for you, not over the weekend. But, if you got to email me about something, I think everybody has my email pretty much overall. So if you got any question about something, just please email me. administratively about the class more than anything. So that's it for today. I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. I think it's going to be kind of a cold weather this weekend, I know, and all that. Hopefully it doesn't mess up our plans for, school next week and all that. But y'all have a great, weekend, of course, coming up. So I'll see you later. I'll have kind of announcements probably sometime over the weekend about later lectures I'll have, of course, next week. So y'all take care. Have a great one.